Welcome to Higher Education, the podcast that explores career development in public education. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Sergo, and in each episode, we explore different topics and aspects of career development. We interview experts and we share practical advice. Today, we're going to be exploring giving and receiving feedback. So let's level up our skills. Whether you're a seasoned professional, a budding entrepreneur, or someone just simply navigating the intricacies of personal relationships in the workplace, we all know that we've had to encounter feedback in various forms. So today we're going to talk about the power of constructive criticism, the nuances of praise, and everything in between. So to guide us through this subject, I've invited two guests to the show today. First, we have Rob Wedge, a senior manager of human resources here in FCPS. Rob oversees our support talent acquisition and team in HR, and he's been with FCPS for more than 10 years. Overall, Rob has over 22 years of experience working in human resources, working with support employees, and over 32 years experience working in public education. We're also thrilled to welcome Dr. Afi Mirsha-Nayar to the podcast. Afi recently joined FCPS. She's our director of high schools. And prior to joining the FCPS team, Afi was working in public education throughout her career. She spent over 20 years in our public school system. She moved from a teaching position to a teaching specialist and on to administrative roles, including principal of a high school. She's clearly demonstrated work history of supporting and developing administrative staff as both a principal and now as a director of schools. So before we dive into our topic, I want to have our guests unlock their fast facts. So Rob, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your experience with giving and receiving feedback? I know this is a skill you practice a lot in your HR role.
So it's interesting that you talk about that, Dr. Sergo, because in my 32 years in public education, I started out as a school counselor. So I was giving and receiving feedback from students all the time regarding how they were handling their academics, preparing for college, and those types of things. And then when I made the transfer to human resources, I found that so many of those skills were able to be transferable into the work that I do in working with support staff.
Yeah, you have a lot of experience both telling people things that they need to hear, but also in listening to people's concerns. So we're glad to have your expertise today.
Thank you.
How about you? I'd love to hear a little bit about your fast facts around yourself and, of course, your experience with giving effective feedback.
So for me, getting feedback for myself has been something that's been important to me throughout my career. I've found those people who are mentors that I can go to. I still have people I call that I ask for feedback and guidance. And so it's been a part of my career to promote myself in that way and my work in that way by growing, being intentional about my own growth and getting feedback so that I can improve. Because it's a part of who I am, I also incorporate it into my work. I think as a high school principal, this was the one skill that helped me the most. High school principal in two different counties, Prince George's County and Montgomery County. My last school, I had 250 staff, 6 administrative team members. That's a lot of people to support. And the best way to do that is with constant communication and feedback. And so for me, I feel that as you're implementing the policies and the procedures of the school system that you work in, as well as just managing the improvement plans of your own building as a school leader, the only way you can do that effectively is by communicating and giving people feedback and basically growing individuals and your teams and organizations through that process.
Well, we're really lucky to have both of you here today. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Have both of you here today to give us your perspective and your thoughts. And I want to go a little bit deeper as we get started. Let's sort of dive in. So one of the things I think need to start with is really distinguishing the difference between feedback and coaching, right? So one of the most powerful tools we have as leaders is to create a healthy and productive workplace. And feedback is a really important part of that. And constructive feedback, feedback that sort of tells you a little bit about our assessment as your supervisor, maybe even as your colleague about how something has gone, is really, really important. Whereas coaching is sort of nothing's happened yet. I'm helping you sort of project yourself into the future. I'm not telling you what you should do, but I'm sort of having you reflect and think about. So I think of feedback as a retrospective, a rear view mirror on something that's already happened, versus coaching is sort of a forward look, a front facing experience. So Rob and Affy, as we start this conversation, I'd love to get your take on the difference and what feedback really is. How is giving feedback different from something like coaching or giving people advice? Rob, let's start with you.
Great. And I think your analogy of the rearview mirror is perfect in that definition of feedback, because you're looking at how did you handle a situation that's already occurred and giving good input there, which is important to see how a person was successful and not so successful. But I look at coaching more as running drills, using sort of a sports analogy. Something may be coming up. How would you handle this situation? Or if we've had that situation that occurred in the past, but this variable had changed, how would that impact the work that you did, the actions you took, or the decisions that you made?
I think that's a great example. And I actually think of coaching. Sometimes we have to coach people on how to give feedback, right? So sometimes we have people say, I really want to give so-and-so feedback about this, or I'd like to share with them how I experienced our conversation or our interaction, but I'm not sure how. So sometimes we can coach people around how to do something like giving feedback. Affy, what would you add to that description? How would you define the difference between feedback and coaching?
I think when you're in a place of giving feedback, especially if you're in a supervisory role, you're also expecting a change in behavior. Something didn't go well and shouldn't be repeated. Something different should happen moving forward. And I think that is part of that process. I think when you're coaching, it's more about maybe unlocking potential. It's about building capacity. It's about helping someone goal set and reach another level. But it isn't about corrective or changing behavior in that something was done that shouldn't have been done that you need to correct. So I think that's another distinction.
Yeah, and I think your point about how do you actually help people just be open to feedback in general. So unsolicited feedback is sometimes the most difficult to accept. So let's sort of start digging into that a bit more. So, because when it comes to providing feedback, we have to sort of establish this expectation, right? This expectation that I'm going to give you feedback, whether it's going as perfectly as can be, or there's an area of growth. I think one of the things sometimes supervisors misstep on is they only give feedback when things have gone wrong, right? That it's not a part of the culture of interacting with people. So if you create the conditions where we're always going to give people feedback, we're going to give it to each other, and it's vertical and horizontal, right? So the people underneath the supervisor, the subordinates, if you will, they give feedback up. The supervisor gives it down, but people are also giving it to each other in a lateral way across teams. But you have to create this mindset that it's okay, because feedback can be hard to hear and it can sometimes be uncomfortable. So I want to talk a little bit about fixed and growth mindset, and sort of, we think about that a lot with children, and we talk a lot about the research on Carol Dweck around growth mindset. And so that's well established, but I'd love to apply that really to this thinking around adults and career development. So Affy, we'll start with you this time. How would you define a fixed or growth mindset? And, you know, when you are thinking about a time that you've provided feedback or a challenge you've had, when there was a fixed mindset, how did you work through that?
I think the first thing for me as I really reflected is when you're dealing with a situation where people are in a fixed place. To change that, you have to change the conversation. And I think you do that before the incident that's happened, where you have to have maybe a more corrective type of feedback. You start as a leader every day with the idea that we can do better, we will do better, we will do as individuals better, we will do better as a team, we will do better as a school. So I think you set that tone. That conversation has to be one of the first things that permeates. That's how you start to change a culture. And so I think that once you do that, then as a leader, you have to model that if people see you being reflective, being open to feedback, making changes based on feedback, I think that helps your teams, that helps others, because you're always being watched as a leader. And so I think you change the conversation. I think you model it. And I think you acknowledge that people are coming at this in different ways and from different places, and that it is hard work. This isn't the prescriptive work of leadership. This is where you have to be very strategic and reflective as you're dealing with people. I have run across people who have been in a fixed place, and that conversation is different than those who are ready for growth and open to a conversation that is more growth-based.
I love what you said about modeling as the leader. And sometimes we get feedback in our leadership roles and we act upon it, but we don't make that visible. And so I think it's a really important reminder to us to say, when you are actually changing things based on feedback, that you call it out. And you say, hey, you said we will. I'm a big believer in sort of that approach, which is to honor that we are making these changes because you've given feedback and you've told us how your experience is. So that's a great reminder. Rob, what about you? How would you define this, and sort of how do you push through challenges with a fixed mindset around feedback?
So those fixed mindsets, it's almost as the person is saying, well, I can't make any changes. Fate has decided that this is all I can do. I can't learn anymore. I can't be any smarter. I can't work more efficiently. I'm stuck. So it's really hard trying to pull someone out of that. And you need to be able to provide examples in their life when they were successful and able to do that. And sometimes that's enough because, as we said, we don't know, like hearing sometimes hard criticism or hard feedback. But if it's done in the correct way with the right mindset, eventually somebody goes, I did need to hear that. I did need to make that change, and I am stuck and I need to get out of that realm. So eventually with good coaching and good modeling, those types of changes can happen.
You bring up a good example about this idea of how you have to sort of just stay with it and help people change their mind and give them examples of how being open can be beneficial. And so I'm thinking a little bit about some of the strategies that we could recommend to the people listening to this to help move the needle on that. And one of the things you just reminded me of is there's a book called Radical Candor. And if you click on our quick bites that go with this podcast, you'll get some more information about it, which is always a reminder. I think some people mistake being direct with permission to be radically candid, right? And so Brene Brown always says, clear is kind. I'm a big believer that how you say something matters almost more than what you are going to say. And so what are the strategies, Rob, that you've seen in your experience, and then Affy will hear from you, that if someone giving the feedback is struggling, what do you suggest they do in terms of their approach?
Well, it's interesting because I did have a team member who I supervised in my past who had a supervisor who never allowed this individual to make any type of decision. And every type of decision had to go through that supervisor. Well, I had a different mindset and wanted to have the right people in the right seats, and then you let them go. So every time this person would come to me, he would say, what should I tell this person? And I'd say, do you know the answer to that? Well, yes, but what do you want me to tell them? So eventually I had to kind of have a conversation with this person to say, you know a lot, and I trust you within giving out information, making decisions within these parameters. So he then would come to me and say, what should I do? So then I started changing the questions and I go, well, what do you think you should do? Or what do you think is a good answer? Well, this is what I think should occur. I think that's great. Or I would tweak things. And eventually he would come to me and he said, I've done this. Should I have done more? So now he was beginning that growth mindset. What am I doing? Am I being successful with this? And it took several years, but we finally were able to have that person get to a spot where they felt comfortable making those decisions and how to get feedback on those decisions that they were making.
That's a great example and a good reminder of how sometimes we have to change our approach, which is going from a more inquiry-based approach or questioning to sometimes even a more directive. This is exactly what I need you to do. This is what I know you can do, sort of a style. Affy, what would you do to add to that?
So Rob mentioned two things that I had also thought about, and maybe in slightly different ways. I think the idea of trust. People are able to have a conversation with you in a different way if they trust you. And again, all of that happens before the conversation. So as a leader, do the work to build trust so that when you need to count on that trust helping you in a conversation or in a different setting, it's there. But I think trust is critical, building trust with your teams, with the people you work with. I think care, when you're just being a human, it's difficult to get feedback that you didn't do something well. And I've had to give feedback to teachers and staff and administrators throughout my career. I haven't had anyone who wanted to get feedback about something that didn't go well, because it's hard. Even people who aren't maybe doing their best think they are doing their best, or they think they made the right decisions at the time. They're not intentionally making wrong decisions. So be a human about how you deliver. I agree in being open, being direct, being honest, coming from a place of care and trust, but also just know that this might be difficult for that person, and plan for it. I'm not a fan of off-the-cuff remarks when it's something that could end up harming someone. So you, as the person giving the feedback, need to do that reflection. When am I going to do this? How am I going to do this? What's the setting? Will the person be visible to others? Is this public or private? How much time do I need? I made the mistake early in my career of having a meeting with the teacher that I knew wasn't going to go well. I knew it wasn't going to go well, but the teacher had planning in the morning. And so we scheduled at that time for her to come meet with me. And it didn't go well because it was a difficult conversation. I realized from that mistake, I just turned around and sent someone who is not in a good place to stand in front of children. So when you do something, really be intentional. So I learned from that one mistake, if I have to have a conversation, it's going to be at the end of the day so that the person doesn't have to get in front of kids or doesn't have to go back to work in a not good mind frame. So really be strategic in this work and think about it and how you approach it. I don't recommend just off the cuff doing it. And I worked a lot as a principal building the capacity of my APs, because with 250 staff, I couldn't be the one who gave this feedback all the time. I couldn't be the one who was the voice. My team represented me, but I wanted them to do it in the way that I would. And so they would observe me in some meetings giving feedback, especially those who were new assistant principals. Then we would reflect on it afterwards. And those reflections actually also helped me to be better at it the next time I did that work. But that's just some of my advice.
Well, it's sort of the phrase reminds me of the phrase tact and timing, right? And so the importance of both in giving feedback. It's sort of a good public service announcement. The worst thing a supervisor can do is send someone an email or slip them a Post-it note that says, "See me." Mm-hmm. Typically, it'll send someone's anxiety through the roof. So sort of being clear and transparent about why you want to meet with someone and to say, "Hey, I would love to give you some feedback on some observations I had from today, or I'd love to talk with you about the meeting that we had earlier this week." And so to be really upfront with people that you're coming to a meeting and you should come in expecting to hear feedback is really, really important. And I'm glad that you brought that up. So let's sort of go a little bit deeper into this. And I want to demystify something that we were probably all trained on, which is something called the feedback sandwich, right? So not unlike if you're an elementary person, you remember the hamburger model, right? Which is the idea that there are buns that are sort of bookends to a conversation, or in that hamburger model case, a writing. But the feedback sandwich is this idea that you start with something positive, you sort of warm them up, you disarm them by making them feel comfortable. Then the meat of the sandwich is the sort of what you really are there to say, right? The truth of it. And then at the end is the other part of the bun where you sort of say, okay, I'm going to say something nice again so that you're not going to be angry at me and you can go on your way. And so I think there's really good intention around the idea of a feedback sandwich. But what's interesting is the research has shown that when you construct your feedback conversations using that sandwich or hamburger model, it actually diminishes the impact both of the positive praise. It sort of makes it seem disingenuous, and it diminishes the ability of the person to take meaning from what you were really there to share. And so, sort of how do we break those habits that sometimes are muscles that we flex for many years around how to have difficult conversations? So I'd love to hear from you about what strategies you use or you recommend others use when they are planning these feedback conversations. So Afi, let's start with you this time. How do you structure those conversations? What's your agenda or itinerary?
So I'm glad you used the word disingenuous, because that's how that model is 100%, and people can see through it. So my approach, I think, as you mentioned, if I'm having a conversation, I'm going to let the person know ahead of time that we need to have a conversation, what the topic is, so that they can mentally prepare for the conversation. It's not a gotcha. It's not a surprise. You can know ahead of time what we're going to discuss. In the conversation, I start usually with saying something around, this might be a difficult conversation, but we're going to go, through this together because we have to discuss how to improve the situation. And then I'll use data and specifics and facts, right? This is not about emotions or feelings. You want to talk about specific actions. And then I always, again, thinking with my school-based principal hat, what was the harm and how can I connect that harm to students? Here's what went wrong. And this is why that doesn't benefit our students in our school or in our school system. So I think being specific about it, and again, that's where you as the person giving the feedback have to plan. I would plan out my talking points. I would write them out. I would have notes. I also think that feedback, although sometimes it is very much one-sided, it doesn't need to be. I always want to ask some questions. I want to hear their perspective on what happened, why it happened. Was this a misunderstanding? What was the situation? Why did they do what they did? And I think that if you are having a genuine, honest conversation, people are more open to reflecting with you and answering your questions. If it feels like a one-way where you're just delivering this information, they're going to sit back and listen. They may not be engaged. I would much rather approach it from a reflective place, a place where the person's engaged, and so that we can build to where's the support I can provide and how do we not do this again and how do we do better? So I think for me, it's just being truly honest. And if it's negative, you as the person giving that feedback have to just say it and just do it. It's uncomfortable the first few times you do it, but you just have to be able to get to a place where your discomfort as the person giving the feedback isn't what messes up this whole process.
I think that's a great point, and I want to highlight and offer consideration. One of the things that I had read in the research, and I think this comes from Adam Grant, who's an organizational psychologist, and he says that sometimes the hardest thing to do is to start a feedback conversation. And he recommends a language frame that sounds something like this. We're going to have a difficult conversation, and it may feel uncomfortable for you to hear some of what I'm going to share, but I'm sharing it with you because I care about you, because I believe in you, and I have high expectations for your work and our relationship. And sometimes when you use that language frame, as the person delivering feedback, which in some cases the question is, who's it harder for, the one delivering it or the person receiving it? If someone says that to me, if I know that they're sharing this in a way that ultimately is an investment in our relationship, and because they have high expectations for me, it will help me to be more open. Because the last thing you want to do is use a hammer on a gnat, right? And so you want to sort of be thoughtful about that. So I appreciate your suggestion. Rob, what about you? How do you try to structure feedback conversations? What strategies would you recommend to our listeners around how to do this?
What I have always found to be successful is know your employee, know how they're going to be how they're going to be reacting to that feedback. So people on my team, I know I may be able to have a quick and fruitful conversation within a short period of time. Others, I may know this is going to be a 3-meeting situation that I'm going to be having with them because I know they're going to react this way. I have to allow them to recoup. Then we can really start having some discussions. So I also look at it as very much as you're dealing with your children. The motivations that you have with one child may not be the ones that work for another child. So you have to be able to flex and not use the same for each employee situation that you have. But being honest and truthful, building on what Afi has said, I think that's going to add to that genuineness. And if you have that trust and you have that openness and you have that honesty, I think eventually those who you're supervising or working with are going to really appreciate the feedback that you're providing to them.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. Again, going back to that notion of tact and timing, right? So that with some people, if you give them too much advance notice, like if you tell them on a Monday that you want to have a feedback conversation on Thursday, their whole week is derailed because they're going to be fixated on worry about that conversation. Some people don't want a lot of notice. They sort of want a little bit more of an ambush approach so that they can sort of rip the Band-Aid off and get the difficulty over with. And others even that do well with that sort of notice on the outside might need some additional processing time and want to come back. Ultimately, many people just want reassurance. Are we okay? And so, even after these feedback conversations, how we go back to employees or our colleagues and make sure that the relationship is intact. And so even just sometimes we have these feedback conversations, we in some ways check the box. We said, yes, we said that, we did that, we took care of that, but also taking care of the person and said, checking in a few days later and say, I just want to make sure you're still feeling okay about our conversation. You know, I really want to reinforce my commitment to you and to our relationship is really important. So now we're going to get into sort of the last section of our conversation today, which is again around this idea of reinforcing feedback and redirecting it. You know, you talked about some really great strategies, but we also want to sort of go back and reinforce sort of how do we give feedback about an area that we think needs to be addressed, refined, improved, corrected, whatever the purpose of the feedback might be, and then deepen that by praise, by saying, you know, verbally acknowledging effort and the pursuit of improvement. So redirecting feedback is a little bit different. So reinforcing, of course, is around praise and encouraging people to persist. But redirecting feedback is stop this and start that, right? Like very clear. I want you to stop emailing after 6 p.m. and start using your, you know, delayed delivery sort of an idea is a very directed. How do you really sort of distinguish when it's time for reinforcing feedback, the acknowledgement, the praise, the keep at it, you're on the right track versus the redirecting? And do you find yourself using more of one versus the other? Rob, I'd love to start with you and get your perspective.
So I had a situation with a team member not too long ago about a situation in which he was giving me what I wanted, but it wasn't enough. And I said, all right, you've given me this product, which is great, but now we need to build on that. And we need to be able to pull out information that's going to give us more efficiencies, that's going to give us the answers that we're looking for. So I want you to go back and do this. And it took him some time because he wasn't quite sure why that wasn't enough, because he thought he was everything. Well, it is, but it's the raw part that we need. I need you to take a next step further. And we got there. And now he is excellent in pulling out that information.
So sometimes it's a bit of keep at this, but if it's just not what you want, it's being that clear with someone and saying, I need something different. This is why I need it. And sort of that redirection in that way.
It takes time. It takes an incredible amount of time, and you need to be consistent with it, but it is an investment well worth it.
Exactly. Afi, what about you? What's been your strategy or your use of reinforcing versus redirecting feedback?
So as a leader, I live in the area of reinforcement. Redirecting, you have to do as part of your job. That's supervisory, that's accountability. That is something that you have to do. But I live in reinforcement. And I think it's so important to acknowledge good work. And I think people are working very hard who don't get that acknowledgement very often. And I think it's even important to have that moment of pause for the person to reflect on the good work that they've done. So I did this all the time. I did this with my admin teams, my leadership teams. I made a note to myself. I had a calendar, and I actually kept track of conversations where I gave positive feedback and specific. It can't be oh, you did a good job today. That doesn't help anybody to grow. It has to be specific and so that they really know that you know what they did and the impact that their work had. But I want to reference a book that I read a while ago called Move Your Bus by Ron Clark. And he, the Ron Clark Academy is known for some amazing student achievement with, student populations that come from across Atlanta. And he talked about the organization as a bus and the people on the bus. And so he talked about there are runners in every organization. Those are the people that go above and beyond. They're working at a pace and getting so much work done. He talked about the joggers. They're putting in effort. They're moving. They're not doing the extra, but they're not harming the organization. They're doing all the right things that you want. They're just not running at the speed of the runners. He talked about the walkers. They're just walking along. And again, they're not, hurting anyone. But again, their level of effort is a little bit less than joggers, certainly less than runners. And then he talks about the people on the bus with their feet up, just getting pulled along. So I feel like when you're in a place of redirecting, a lot of times, not all the time, but a lot of times it's those people who are being pulled along, not putting forth the effort that you are correcting and you want different actions from them. He talks about, though, that as a leader, you should really be investing in those runners. And I have a quote from him where he talked about that having runners maintain their pace and maintain their effort and their motivation and their momentum is more beneficial than getting one rider to lift their feet and start walking. And so I thought about that a lot as a leader. Who are the people in the organization that are working with excellence? They're the backbone. They're the above and beyond people, putting forth a lot of effort and energy for kids. Those people are the ones that you should, as a leader, be spending time with. And those are those reinforcing conversation. And I think you approach those in the same way. It shouldn't be off the cuff. It should be intentional. You should, spend time. It shouldn't just be in a hallway, in a comment as you're passing by. Spend some time and talk with them about their effort, the work they're doing, recognizing the impact it's having, and also thanking them. And I think, you should really live in that reinforcement place, and that's where your time should be. That helps the organization, that helps the person to continue their hard work and feel valued. Again, you have to go to that other redirective place, but that isn't where I lived as a leader.
Well, and that's really helpful, this idea of making sure that you reinforce and provide positive praise and feedback to your high performers. And that actually takes us into our closing section and one of our listener questions. So that's a great segue. So we have a listener question that said that they desperately want meaningful feedback from their supervisor, but during their evaluation, when they ask for it, the supervisor says to them, well, you're doing a great job. There's nothing really you need to work on. So to that end, what would you say is a good strategy, or what would you suggest to an employee who wants more feedback from their supervisor or their teammates even? Rob, let's start with you. How do you suggest people solicit feedback that want more of it in their experience?
So I would be asking them, what would be the goal of this feedback? Are you looking to increase in your professionalism? What are your goals? And how can I tailor make that feedback for where you're hoping to go? And then providing feedback on, here are some things that you can change or modify in what you're doing, or here are additional opportunities that I can provide for you.
That's actually an excellent example, and I'll use a personal story to illustrate why I connect with that. When I started my career, I started actually as a speech language pathologist, and I was working on my administrative degree with my eyes set on doing some sort of supervisory work. And so when I went to my principal at the time and said I wanted feedback, she was like, you're highly effective as a speech language pathologist. And so I said, well, I would like to get my administrative degree. And so I'd like a little bit more feedback around the skills associated with being an administrator. She said, oh, well, that's a totally different perspective. And so I think it's really good. There's a difference between me giving you feedback on a job you have and something that might be more aspirational. So I really appreciate you illustrating the importance of knowing why you want feedback. Is it to improve on what you're doing now, or is it sort of projecting into a future goal that you have? Afi, what about you? What would you recommend to someone who wants to get more feedback from their supervisor or their teammates?
So I think your supervisor is an important place, and I think giving them the heads up and being specific. So again, like you shared, what do you want to know? What specifically do you want feedback on? Is it a certain project? Is it a certain standard? Just asking for open feedback doesn't help the other person give you good feedback. So I think be specific first. Acknowledge that people have calendars and they're busy. And so if you just walk up to someone and say, I want feedback, they may not be in the right place to provide it. So schedule it in advance, give them the opportunity to think about it, and give you that feedback. But I also think it's really important to not just focus on your supervisors or your teammates. There are a lot of people that you can go to that can give you feedback, and finding those mentors throughout your career, people you've worked with, I think that is almost more beneficial sometimes, is getting other voices and other perspectives. All of them help make you better. And so I think that going to multiple places, planning in advance, letting people have time to think about what they want to share with you, and helping them by being specific about what you need. I think just your purpose, I think is important, but also specifically, how do you want this? How are you going to use this feedback is important for them to know.
Right. And I think just sort of building between both what you and Rob shared, it's this idea of what specific feedback do you want? So when people would come up to me and say, I'd love to get your feedback on my work, I'm like, well, that can go in so many directions. So, is there something you're working on? So if someone says, I'm really working on being more clear in my written communication, I would love your feedback on something I've written. Or I'm really working on the precision of how I communicate really complicated data to parents. Whatever it is, to be as specific as you can so that someone can enter into that space with knowing exactly what it is you're trying to improve. So those are two great pieces of advice. So as we get to the end, we end our podcast always with the same sort of leveling up question to each of our guests. So I'll start with you, Affy, and then close with Rob. If you could offer one piece of advice to someone aiming to level up in their chosen field or passion, what would it be?
I think consider how you're building the capacity of others. I think that for me, that has helped me grow when I have focused on building the capacity of others. As a principal, I spent a lot of time with my assistant principals. I'm so proud of the fact that 5 of them are principals now. 1 is a principal intern. Another one is about to be an intern across different school systems. And that was an investment I made in them. Out of my assistant principals, 4 of them are now pursuing doctorate degrees. And that's because we spend a lot of time talking and, I encourage them. So I think if you're trying to level up for yourself, it's not just about me doing a good job in the role that I have. It's who do you bring along with you? And I always go back to leaders create other leaders. So I think that for me is the big thing that I've used in my career is building the capacity of others, builds my capacity, it builds capacity for our organizations. And then you can not only say that I can do my job well, but I can help others do their job. And I think that's powerful.
That's wonderful. It reminds me of the quote, tell me who you spend time with and I will tell you who you are, right? And so this idea of where we spend our time and how we invest in them, that's great advice. Rob, what about you? What piece of advice would you give to someone aiming to level up in their chosen field or passion?
Well, I would just tell them, don't lose your excitement for your profession. Always remain excited about coming to work and attacking those challenges and strategies that you're dealing with. And if you start to lose that excitement, take it upon yourself to reinvigorate yourself and what changes you need to do to capture that excitement again.
Thank you so much to both of you. Unfortunately, we're getting to the end of our show today, but I want to thank you both for joining us, for taking time to come and chat with us about how we can give and receive feedback. We'll be continuing this conversation next month and going deeper into it a little bit with some new guests as we expand and elaborate on our perspectives on how to do this well. So that wraps up today's episode of Leveling Up. We hope our discussion about giving and receiving feedback was helpful to those current employees and also to our job seekers out there. Remember, constructive feedback is crucial. It's a helpful step to drive your reflection as an employee and ultimately your growth as an individual and inside the organization. Join us again next time for another insightful episode. Until then, keep thriving in your careers and share and like this podcast. Thank you.